Hi, I'm Sarah.
And I'm Rena, and welcome to
Biopic, a podcast story. This is a podcast where we dissect the good, bad, ugly, and absurd of this specific genre of motion picture, the biopic. If you want to learn more about us, our scoring system, and how we choose movies, please check out our special introductory episode, Introduction, Who Are We, and What Are We Doing?
Sarah, what movie are we doing this week?
This week, we will be talking about Saint Joan. And Rena, can you give us the trigger warning?
This movie contains depictions of torture, violence, misogyny, burning at the stake.
There's some really aggressive imagery of a very young girl being surrounded by sinister men throughout this film.
This film may be triggering to people who prefer a flattering portrayal of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, Catholics not so great in this one. And Rena, can you please give us the spoiler warning?
Spoiler warning. We are going to spoil everything, including possibly the major plot points of works of narrative art having nothing to do with this particular movie, Saint Joan, starring Jean Seberg. Consider yourself warned.
And some of the sources we used to make this episode possible are the podcast Gone Medieval, the episode about Joan of Arc, also Played Out, the Jean Seberg story by David Richards, and the amazing You Must Remember This podcast series. They did several episodes called Jean and Jane, about Jane Fonda and Jean Seberg, and Karina Longworth is brilliant and has an incredibly compassionate view of both her and Jane Fonda, and it's a really wonderful series.
I also read Joan of Arc, A Life Transfigured by Katherine Harrison. I listened to a bunch of other podcasts. There were multiple Gone Medieval episodes on Joan of Arc. I also listened to Queen's podcast so that I could learn about some women who were tangential to Joan of Arc who aren't in this movie, like Yolande of Aragon, who was Charles VII's mother-in-law, who is partly responsible for bringing Joan into court. And I listened to the Battle Royale podcast episodes on Charles VI and Charles VII.
I personally am very excited to talk about this. I'm a huge Joan of Arc fan.
Can you please tell us a little bit about Joan of Arc and the film Saint Joan?
So, Joan of Arc, this is all from our friends at Wikipedia. A patron saint of France, she is honored as a defender of the French nation for her role in the Siege of Orleans and her insistence on the coronation of Charles VII of France during the 100 Years' War, claiming to be acting under divine guidance. And she was burned at the stake as a heretic because of the Catholics. Saint Joan is a 1957 historical drama adapted from George Bernard Shaw's play, Saint Joan, which is about her life. And the film was directed by one monster named Otto Preminger. And the restructured screenplay was done by Graham Greene. And the film cost $1 million and earned $250,000 at the box office. It was also the film debut of Jean Seberg, an actress who really never quite got her due, but was quite lovely and brilliant in her own way.
I know Jean Seberg from Breathless, and everyone loves her in Breathless. Breathless is also the only Goddard film that I like. I have tried to like other Goddard films. I can't. I feel like Goddard's work outside of Breathless is people eating or staring into the middle distance while a voiceover reads Karl Marx.
He is not for me. It's the polite way of putting it. I find a lot of his work veers in the direction of insufferable, but I love Breathless, and part of the reason I love Breathless is because of Jean Seberg. I'm going to do a little bit of weird Sarah stuff right now and just talk a little bit about Saint Joan. So recovering Catholic or whatever. I had to get confirmed, and part of that is you can take on a patron saint name. As you know, Rena, I wanted to convert to Judaism from a very early age, but part of the reason why I was okay getting confirmed is because I could take on the Saint Joan name as part of my confirmation process. I think that Joan of Arc is a really amazing, like, feminist model of sainthood. And also, Jean Seberg is someone I really like her as an actress. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about how she got this part right now, if you're interested in hearing about that.
I am.
So Otto Preminger announced he was going to make this movie, and he went on a sort of a very publicity savvy casting hunt for a new face to play Joan of Arc in this movie. Jean Seberg was ultimately selected from over 18,000 young women, he said. She found out she got the role when she was 17. She was just a very, like, classic quotidian Midwest girl who wanted to be an actress. And she had this beautiful long hair, and, you know, and they cut her hair off, and Otto Preminger had a very distinct vision of who she was going to be, and he was going to make her a star in his imagined image. And she was under just a tremendous amount of pressure for someone who had absolutely no resources. The publicity machine was just on fire for her from the second she got the role. They introduced her on the Ed Sullivan Show, which we have talked about on this podcast, and the important cultural role that show had throughout its run. When she was on set, Otto Preminger engaged in what could be politely described as heavily paternalistic behavior. He had a lot of control over her days and nights and kept her very isolated from her coworkers. She was also the only young person on the set of this movie that was heavily populated by very accomplished and seasoned actors. And she also had to do a lot of, like, other training, like writing training and French training and all of this stuff. So she was really sort of kept apart and alone. Preminger was very cruel to her on set, and she didn't know what she was doing. And he's one of those directors who likes to do a cajillion takes, and he would give her contradictory information between takes, so she would get very confused. And the other actors would say to him, like, dude, you have to chill. He was kind of like method directing her, I guess, because he wanted her to read as a very confused teenage girl. He also, quote, accidentally set her on fire when they were filming the, spoiler alert, they burn her at the stake at the end of this movie. When they were filming that, she actually was burned by that. She had scars on her stomach. She was literally scarred for life by this fire, and he used some of that footage in the film. The movie came out, it got pretty bad reviews for her, and Preminger had her on a 7-year contract to work with him that was going to annually, she was going to make a little bit more money each year, so she had to stay in his good graces. She signed up to make Bonjour Tristesse next with him. So she made that next after this with him immediately. Her life is hugely tragic because of what ended up happening to her, which ultimately would, like, rope in some of our century's greatest heroes, like J. Edgar Hoover. Yeah, they had a file on her and alleged that she was impregnated by a Black Panther, because she also had, like, some very messy political interests later on in her life. And she died by suicide in 1979. We all know the haircut that exactly one person named Jean Seberg can have. I came into this movie thinking, like, I'd seen it before, and I didn't have, like, the critical eye that one might need at that time, like, to judge it. And I kind of came back into this to watch this, and I thought, oh, she's going to be terrible in this. And I thought that she was actually quite good.
Preminger sounds like he was a headache to work with. I know I read that there was an incident on the set of Carmen Jones where he was being awful to Dorothy Dandridge, and Harry Belafonte called him out on it and said, "Miss Dandridge is my leading lady and you will treat her with respect."
There's a wonderful prescience to the way that George Bernard Shaw wrote this, and I like the Joan that he sees and that he writes. Sometimes I wonder a little bit, like, if my love for her is more about the character that he created. There's a lot of like really arresting images in this that are just like, since time immemorial, a bunch of shitty dudes have surrounded a young woman and told her that what her experience isn't real. And the first half of this movie is not nearly as good as the second.
Really? Because I found the first half to be romp almost, and the second to sort of drag.
It's so interesting that you say that, because yeah, the first half is really like, there is a bananas tonal shift in this film when it goes from like her winning the battle and like her being like, I'm collecting people for my army. With God at my side, I will be safe, and I will do this thing that I have been asked to do by my saints. There's a little bit of like a lightness to it. And where it turns to in the end, just watching her try and explain herself and trying to hold on to who she is in the face of, welcome back to the show, John Gielgud, four-timer. Who knew we were going to spend so much time with him playing a dick? Didn't know that was going to be part of this journey. I found that devastating to kind of witness, like these dudes with all of these competing interests fight over who is going to shut her down the hardest.
We open on some footage of little like round things on stems that I guess are supposed to be the dinging thing in the bell, moving back and forth abstractly before we cut to, and I loved this framing device so much. We cut to Charles VII, the former Dauphin, having a dream, and he's an old man now. We go back to this around the middle of the film, and then again at the end, and I called it the Christmas Carol framing device, but where Joan is the ghost of Christmas past. I love a time travel story. And I love things where people have encounters with other people out of their own time and envisioning how that would go down. I found this framing device cumulatively delightful. And it's in Shaw's original play, and George Bernard Shaw is on a short list of English writers to have an adjective derived from their name, which includes Shakespearean, Dickensian, Orwellian, and Shavian.
I went back through the play because, as I said, Joan, patron saint of drama queens, she has a play written about her. I was taken by how closely the screenplay does hew to the original play. Joan shows up and she's a little perky for someone who's been burned at the stake.
As I was considering the adaptation of Shaw to screen, this reminded me of why I never want to do the Shakespeare histories. I can't give a screenplay by Shakespeare less than a 10, even if the adaptation doesn't work. But they don't really hew well to accuracy. They're better seen live. And I thought about that because there are things where it looks like we're watching a filming of a stage production where they had somewhat more leeway in terms of changing the set. They put in scenes of people riding on horses and people outside just to say, look, we're in a movie. And I know that Preminger could direct an epic. I'm just thinking of like the vistas in Exodus. So I don't feel like enough work was done here to broaden it from the stage. At the same time, it's Shaw, so it's some amazing dialogue, and how can I possibly downrate that?
It's interesting that you say all that. I found myself asking, like, from the jump, I was like, why are we here? Why do we have this movie? It seems really like a strange choice for Preminger, and also, like, to your point, like, it's a very enclosed product. Battles ostensibly take place outside. We're barely outside. It feels essentially like I, Claudius, with better production value in terms of the strictures.
I'm feeling the word claustrophobic, which sort of does make sense when Joan is in prison later. It is a weird choice for Preminger to make this such an indoorsy, contained thing when we know he could make an epic. I wonder what led to this being such a stagey production. The budget was $1 million in 1957, but that was a decent budget for back then. So Joan appears as the ghost of Christmas Present, and we see that, like, Charles has a weird little personality. This is something that he'll, like, struggle with later, that he's not kingly or expansive or charismatic or any of the things that he was supposed to be. One of the things in Seberg's performance is I absolutely believe every second that she believes her voices are real. My go-to when one of these people in the Middle Ages or in olden times says that they're seeing saints or hearing voices or having visions is ergot poisoning.
What is ergot poisoning?
Ergot poisoning is when mold grows on certain types of grain. I think it might be rye. It's related to how they make LSD, and they think that ergot poisoning might have caused the Salem witch trials because the grain got moldy, they ate some, they had visions.
That totally makes sense, that would be a thing, and that it would cause that, and that people would chalk that up to visions. But yeah, she's completely, like, she is committed to her experience throughout this, which I respect.
You see it in her eyes and in her face, the ardor with which she believes. Charles asks her, like, how did you convince everyone? And she says it was a matter of eggs. We then cut to another stagey interior of a courtyard where Joan's been hanging out for weeks.
She is on fire for the Lord. She is on fire for France. She's like, I am here to raise an army and force the English out of France. And some dudes are fighting about this and are kind of like, what do we do with her? And they start calling her a slut, which is cool, because that's what we call women. She insists, give me troops, and I'm going to force the English out of France. And she's kind of like this very pretty, perky Catholic scold, would be how I might describe her. And she goes to meet up with Charles, who we meet, and as you pointed out, he's not a good fit for the role of king.
He's callow, he's finicky, he's sort of a weirdo, and people boss him around. I love how whoever was doing wardrobe captures that nothing fits him very well. It doesn't matter what he puts on, it always looks ungainly. There's a famous portrait of him where he's actually much, much older there, but he's wearing this weird-looking hat that makes him look like a kid with cancer trying to cover it with a weird hat, but they have a hat like that here that he puts on, and it looks terrible on him. And I love the persona that they come up with for him. He has to care whether people like him. At the same time, he doesn't. So some background on this. Henry V, the guy that everyone roots for during the St. Crispin's Day speech, Henry V has died, and his brothers are holding France for his infant son, Henry VI, who will be totally ineffectual. Charles VI, the father of Charles VII, was nuts. He thought he was made of glass, and that he would break if you touched him. Charles's mother's name is Isabeau of Bavaria. They signed this treaty with Henry V, where they say, yes, you can be the next king of France. And Charles was not supposed to be the Dauphin. He had a bunch of older brothers who kept dying. Also, the way that Henry VI goes crazy looks similar to how Charles VI, his grandpa, went crazy.
Now, is this another case of moldy grains?
Henry VI would go catatonic for years at a time, where people would like sit him up and feed him and lay him down again to go to bed, and he was not present, and then he'd become more present, but he would be, people called him a holy fool. His idea of how to fix political problems in England is to make everyone walk the streets of London holding hands with their enemy.
Shut up. You are pulling my leg right now. That is not a real thing.
Henry VI, at one of his points when he's not catatonic, thinks that this is how to fix all of his political problems, is to have Loveday and have the people in the Yorkist and Lancastrian political factions take a walk through London that everyone sees, where they hold hands with the people they've been fighting with. I am not making this up.
That is some Eric Adams shit right there. That's insane. That's insane. So basically, Charles comes by his princely breeding and his weird, like, ticky. He's kind of a little bitch.
He has these weird tics, and it's like a semi-stammer. And the actor is consistent in getting these things, where Joan shows up to meet the Dauphin and she wants to put him on the throne, and she finds this weird little guy who doesn't seem like someone anyone would follow, and she's there to tell him, no, you're the Dauphin, I'm going to put you on the throne. Charles, who was never supposed to be in this spot except that his older brothers kept dying. He's supposed to be like the fourth spare. And he looks like a fourth spare, and he knows it.
Yeah, there's nothing really royal about him. He's like at one point playing hopscotch, which it seemed to really suit him really well.
He's playing hopscotch after he's king, and he's telling like one of the pages, no, you're drawing the squares too big. It's great. He's not a leader. He's not at all kingly. And Joan believes in him because she believes in France. She believes in her voices. And despite everything, she's telling him to be a man and to be the man, because the saints told her to put him on the throne. So yes, Joan says that she will break the siege at Orleans. And she succeeds. She goes and she meets the bastard of Orleans, who is a real person, whose brother, Duc d'Orléans, who is a relative of the king, had been taken in battle and was held hostage by the English for 25 years. He was born out of wedlock, so he's holding down Orleans for his brother, who's being held hostage by the English. She calls him Jack, the bastard of Orleans. He makes some great observations about war, and then she prays and the wind changes, just like the hens who hadn't been laying eggs suddenly started laying eggs after she got the big guy in the earlier scene to give her people to go to meet the Dauphin with.
Yeah, and it works. And she wins the battle. And she goes back and she's triumphant. And everyone's like, cool, can you go? We don't like you anymore.
Yeah, no one knows what to do with her. So it shows the coronation. You see how ridiculous Charles looks in the robes, and he complains that the holy oil they anointed him with was rancid. Joan will have suggestions later, like, we must take Paris. And he says, where are we going to get money to take Paris with? We just spent everything we could borrow throwing this coronation that we have to have because of you, and we're in a great spot now to make a better treaty with the English. So there's a whole thing about diplomacy and treaties versus just go in there and win if you think you can. And like the back and forth between the true believer and the cynic. There's one point where Joan steps away and cries, and I feel like she has a sense of just who this man she's been working for really is. Everybody is turning on her, she overhears Charles saying, oh, she had her uses. And she makes a choice that'll be fatal to her.
She seems to know that she has these two paths, and she chooses one that is going to get her in trouble. And the next thing we know, she has been imprisoned, and she is going to go on trial for being a heretic because, she's too loud about her stuff.
In between, to remind us of where we are and what's going on, and to introduce John Gielgud as the Earl of Warwick, we cut back to the Christmas Carol framing device, and some more great lines that I didn't write down. Warwick cynically making observations about heaven and hell and where they meet, and he apologizes to her at one point and says it was only politics.
She wants to retake Paris from the English now, and they're all like, no, we're not going to do that. She is going to get the common people to march on Paris, but she is captured and handed over to the English, and then the English hand her over to the Catholic Church, which is going to try her for heresy, which, not unlike the previously mentioned Salem witch trials, her fate has already been decided. And she is in a cell. She is being tortured while they try and get her to confess to her heresy. But she continues to be like, no, this is what happened. This is what's real. It's about like shutting down a woman who is gaining a voice in a movement and is gaining prominence, because Catholics do not like that. They don't like the power structure being challenged. We saw it happen to Jesus, although that was the Romans, but nevertheless, not a good idea to say that you're hearing from the Lord yourself and to hang on to that, because they don't like that. And everyone's fighting about it. They're fighting about, what do we do with this girl? They tell her, we're going to burn you at the stake unless you take this back. And she panics and she signs a confession. And then they tell her, okay, cool, we're not going to burn you, but we are going to keep you in a cell for the rest of your life so you can't infect the populace with your girly shit. She says, never mind, I take it back. You may burn me at the stake, because that is not any way to live. So they do it. And it's very upsetting. The whole sequence, one of the things that I thought is particularly effective about her casting was that she was so young, and you're surrounding her with all of these seasoned actors, and you see her smallness with them. The camera work and the direction really highlights that in a way where you see that she is a tiny little person. And all of these powerful men are fighting about, how do we deal with this little person who is going to cause us endless trouble unless we shut this down. And we don't believe women most of the time. And even if we do, we're like, let's put some caveats on this. The lengths that we will go to are to twist ourselves into pretzels to try and like make sure that we don't have to believe inconvenient words from a female, because it's going to upset the legend of a male. And you see that all over this movie. It's storytelling that's timeless and also very much ahead of itself. When Shaw wrote this, we weren't hearing a lot from women, and we've seen this scene with Joan at the end. Like, we have seen the last 45 minutes of this movie so many times in the last couple of decades alone. It had an impact on me, and I thought about it a lot. I'm not going to tell everyone to go out and see this movie because it's not the best, but it was very effective. And I know Preminger tormented this very young girl to get that performance and everything. But it's very moving. I was very affected by it.
IRL. Joan was, after the coronation, they send her around to a bunch of little things because they don't know what to do with her. And she's eventually captured by the Burgundians at Compiègne, and she's moved around from castle to castle for a while they figure out what to do. The Burgundians sell her to the English. And I guess it's in the interest of dramatic trimming that Shaw cuts back in, or Graham Greene cuts back in with her in the hands of the Earl of Warwick. She also had 2 trials because she didn't understand when she made that agreement, okay, I'll say that it was heresy. She didn't know that she was going to be imprisoned for the rest of her life. And after the first, she puts on men's clothes again and says, no, I take back my recanting. One of the people I listened to said, it's suspicious that if she was supposed to only be wearing women's clothes, where was she able to find men's clothes again to put on? Like, they wanted to catch her out on something that she'd even have the access. And she has a second trial where she's sentenced to burn at the stake. Joan is the only Catholic saint to have been killed by the Catholic Church. And that is why Joan is a virgin saint and not a martyred saint, because the church killed her.
We did a great job with this one.
We have full transcripts of her trials, so she's the first woman since antiquity to have this much documentation, where she went and what she did and what she said. And it's a few years barely out of a very short life. Charles didn't come for her. Her friend Jack the Bastard didn't come for her. In real life, there were a few people who tried and were stopped, and they lead her to the stake to burn her to death. And you see this one soldier stop and say, she asks for a cross to look upon, and this one soldier ties 2 twigs together to give to her to look at, and she's burned to death. And in between, the churchmen have interesting observations about faith and heresy, and that it's the innocent who suffer. In the transcripts from the trials, you can see her get more and more confused because she was being interviewed by theologians while not knowing this slew of complex theory. These are the people who debated about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. She doesn't know that they have various rules they've come up with about whether visions are from the devil or from God, and they wore her down over months of questioning in court.
She was a child.
She was a child. One of the priests who had been the most gung-ho about we need to get her comes back in tears, and Warwick is a cold cucumber. And then this is a real thing, that they made sure that she was burned completely to ash and then threw whatever was left into the river so that they couldn't get relics from her. And you see that alluded to where the executioner takes payment from Warwick to have done this. And they're like, well, that's the last we'll hear of her. And then Warwick is like, I wonder. And we go back to my favorite framing device. I just find this delightful, this like meetup of the ghosts and spirits to talk about the future. And it's so much fun for me to watch. And it's because I love a time travel story where you get to envision combinations of people interacting and what they'd say to each other. That soldier that made the cross for her says, yeah, I'm in hell the rest of the time, but I get one day. And Warwick says something that reminds me of Terry Pratchett, where he's like, yeah, all of the interesting people wind up in hell. The soldier talks about, oh, it's a republic now. And Charles is like, republic? And Jones, he says, like, could you go fix that? And Jones says, if you ask me with your whole heart. And that's been a thing, that none of these powerful people ever do anything with their whole hearts. Just Joan.
They come around to, like finding out like that, like they retried her and found her not guilty and cleared her name. But she's dead. And she's like, yeah, I'm dead.
In the original play, they carry this forward a bit more, because I love a thing in time travel where you see people just reacting to hearing things about the future. Like, I could listen to that stuff all day, even though it's so telling, not showing. Just have someone show up and start saying, yeah, then this happens, and then this happens, and then just to see how someone from the past century reacts. I love this so much. And in the play, there's a point where someone shows up and and they're from 1920, and they're there to say, "We've made you a saint," and the guy is wearing like a suit and top hat from 1920, and Charles and Joan laugh at him and say, "You've come up with the most ridiculous outfit we've ever seen." And I also liked that Charles is just irritable. Like, he's seeing a conversation between the spirits of dead people, and he's like, "Can you all just go away so I can sleep?" There's another thing that they cut from the play where it's like, well, did Joan make a man of him? And he talks about Agnes Sorel. Agnes Sorel is Charles's mistress, and she's like the first of the big name official French mistresses. There's a portrait of her where she has one breast hanging out. And yeah, Charles is annoyed because he's a little bitch, and he just wishes that all of these people from this fantastical dream, where I would love to watch people from different times interacting, would just go away and let him sleep. So they do, and Joan says, "When will Earth be ready to receive your saints?" Because they've talked about how people appreciate her because she's dead. And they do a good job making her look like someone who's been locked up and imprisoned for months and months and months. So it's nice to see her looking like healthy and rosy again as a spirit/ghost.
It's a really kind of confoundingly weird movie.
Why are you making a movie this way where it just feels like you're filming a stage play? Anna Christie version from 25 years earlier, where they hadn't figured out that you could dub, and Greta Garbo is talking into a mic that they've hidden in like food on the table, where they had to film everything so that it's basically a love story between a few people in a kitchen table. I felt like even those felt less stagey than this, and I'm wondering why that is.
It's a weird movie. It feels like Preminger went through like a period of like religious messiness in the late 50s, and he was like, I gotta make this movie.
It feels like Graham Greene barely adapted this thing, though.
They trimmed it quite a bit, but the core remains. I feel like, knowing what we know about Preminger, he's the weirdest choice for a director to make this movie. Because he hates women.
The one other woman that you see much of here is that woman wearing the ridiculous double hennin. A hennin is the pointy thing that they wore with the filmy veils hanging down from it. And if you had one that was in two horns, it was a double hennin. He makes any woman who isn't Joan look ridiculous. So more info on the Earl of Warwick. Corpse capers.
Are those squirrels? What's on his grave?
So on one side, there is a chained bear, and on the other, there is some sort of griffin thing. He has this gorgeous effigy that somehow was not destroyed when Henry VIII broke up the monasteries. Warwick dies in bed, but his family comes to a bad end that I doubt Joan would have wished on them. His daughter marries his daughter marries a guy who is known, like, they call Warwick the Kingmaker here, but that was actually his son-in-law. Warwick's daughter has two daughters who wind up married to younger brothers of Edward IV. One of them, Isabel, married to George, Duke of Clarence, who was accused of treason and drowned to death in a barrel of wine by his brothers. Isabel dies in childbirth. Her sister Anne is married to Richard III after her first husband, the son of the deposed Henry VI, dies in battle. She dies fairly young. Richard tries to marry his niece Elizabeth of York, who marries Henry VII instead. Two grandchildren, Margaret Pole and Teddy Warwick. The boy is beheaded by Henry VII, but Warwick's whole line comes to a bad, sad end. He has descendants, and they're kind of on their toes because through Edward IV's younger brothers, they're the last Plantagenets, so of course the Tudors are looking for any excuse to off them. His crimes are revisited on his progeny. His daughter winds up with very little because her children get an act of parliament to declare her legally dead while she's still alive so that they can divvy up her property.
If your kids do that, you failed as a parent. Like that's your sign right there that you have not been amazing at parenting.
Yeah.
Wow. These people, man, these people are all messy. I feel like we should talk a little bit about Baz Luhrmann doing a Joan of Arc movie, which I hope that never happens. I am 80% of the time a Baz Luhrmann apologist, but I don't know what else needs to be said about Joan of Arc in film by men. I would be super interested in a woman making a Joan of Arc movie. I think that there were some interesting contextual things happening when this film was made that could have been pulled into the film a little bit more creatively. You mentioned Salem Witch Trials, and The Crucible is all about HUAC. This is a movie about grinding people down to tell on themselves. I'm not interested in another adaptation of this story that kind of goes over the same things with her. And I don't know that there's anything new to say. Love Jonas, I do. You know, what else is there? And can we maybe get a lady involved in telling that story? I don't understand how Baz Luhrmann's filmmaking sensibility will lend itself well to this story either. But, we'll see.
We have a silent film from a couple years after Birth of a Nation. We have the 1928 one. We have the Ingrid Bergman. Ingrid Bergman was too old to be playing Joan of Arc. We have the one from the 90s, which looks insane. We have a couple French ones that nobody paid attention to over here, where they just came out, and one is her girlhood and one is later. It's been done a bunch of times. The Joan that shows up in the Henry VI plays is not our Joan. And do you have any choice dialogue, Sarah?
There was one line I really liked. She's talking to the bastard, and he says to her, "Do you expect people to love you?" And it was like, ain't that the truth about being a lady right there, is that she does all of these courageous things, and she's given the red flag right away that it's gonna win her no awards and no prizes and no loyalty.
So I also picked a line from Jack the Bastard, but it's from earlier when he says to her, "If you delivered me from fear, I should be a very good knight for a storybook, but a very bad commander of the army."
True bravery is not fearlessness. It is seeing the fear and doing it anyway.
Sarah, can you please give our listeners a quick refresher about how we score movies?
So we rate movies on a 1 to 10 scale across 10 areas that we find to be subjectively and or objectively important to most films, but tailored to specific issues particular to biopics. If you want more details on how we score movies, please scroll down to our webpage at biopicapodcaststory.podbean.com. You'll also find a record of our scores, fair and unfair, for past episodes.
I would highly recommend listening to our special introductory episode, Introduction, Who Are We and What Are We Doing?, where we give a rundown of the methodology, why it matters to us, and some of the inspirations behind this podcast.
And with that out of the way, let's score this thing.
So, outward appearances, makeup, and hair, I gave it an 8. Seberg is luminous, and there is that haircut that only looks good on her. I guess because it's black and white, and because I watched the grainy-free YouTube version of this, I wondered, is this why the old age makeup on Charles looks okay to me? Because I feel like this would not look okay in a sharper film.
Agreed. I also gave it an 8. And one of the reasons why I gave it an 8 is because I recalled from our episode about Beckett, when we were talking about the hairdos and how Richard Burton could not be seen with the full throttle hair of the time. And everyone in this movie had the full throttle hair of the time and looked absurd. All of the men. Seberg looked beautiful.
Actually, IRL Joan had that bowl haircut that they put on all the men here and points to them for that. And at the trial, her hair was shaved when she became a penitent in that brief window where between recanting and de-recanting, which is a whole area of choices women make around their hair, where choosing to cut it yourself is liberating, but having it shaved non-voluntarily is a form of humiliation. The one thing Preminger didn't do to Jean Seberg is to make her wear a medieval bowl cut.
At the end of the day, he was a dude, and he knew the bone structure to die for on this woman. So next, acting and casting. Do they capture the spirit of the people they are playing? And beyond that, is the acting good? I gave it an 8. She was, as I said, fantastic and unfairly maligned in this role. And she gets better and better as the movie goes on. And everyone else was super solid.
Yeah, I gave it a 9. Richard Widmark did a good job creating an ornery, dislikable character and kind of making us enjoy him being incorrigible.
There was good, good acting going on there in terms of his physicality and the way that he played young and then played old.
He wasn't afraid to look ridiculous in the hopscotch scene. But I think it's about the way that people's mannerisms kind of ossify and become caricature-like as they age.
Passage of Time, I gave it a 5. I didn't know where I was most of the time. I didn't feel like they did the most amazing job explaining the passage of time, but whatever.
Yeah, I gave it a 4. They barely alluded to how Joan was taken and wound up in prison. I didn't quite understand how much time was passing that crucial year plus when she was making her name known. Although I did understand pretty well it's ages and ages later, and Charles is old. For costuming, I gave it a 7.
Same. Oh my God, we are on the same page tonight. Same. Costuming 7.
It looked good, nothing terribly exciting. There were a few notes of authenticity that I liked, that it looked ridiculous. I liked that they did Charles's stupid hat. Quality of the script, I gave it a 7. Again, why I never want to do a Shakespeare history. It's Shaw, but as a screenplay, they barely adapted it from being stagey to film it.
It feels like they just cut a bunch of stuff to make it shorter.
So the quality of the script rating is blasphemous because it's George Bernard Shaw. It's that the adaptation is barely an adaptation.
Yeah. Quality of the script, I also gave a 7. Accuracy, I gave it a 4.
I gave it a 4 too.
What is happening tonight? Oh my gosh.
Looked at, omission versus replacing truth with story. And then my go-to was, I cannot warrant rating this lower than Caligula, which I gave a 4 to. For storytelling, I gave it an 8 because I love the Christmas Carol fantastical time travel device.
I gave it a 6 for storytelling. I like the way they shifted the framing device around. And it's Shaw. Production value, I gave it a 7.
I gave it a 6. I thought a lot of it looked like stage sets, and I want to believe that they weren't, and that what I thought I saw was because I watched a freely available print on YouTube, and maybe that was making it fuzzier, and maybe stuff looked more real in the official print that I would have paid for.
Yeah. Production, direction, decision making, I gave it a 7. I don't agree with his methods, but he got great performances out of people.
Yeah, I gave it a 6 just as a summation of everything that we talked about. Remember when I got mad at you during scoring Frida, where you dinged it for Harvey Weinstein being an asshole?
I don't want to thread the needle this way because I don't want to apologize for Otto Preminger at all. However, I will say that his terrible treatment and decision-making around his behavior on set was, at least it was in service of the art. Harvey Weinstein was just doing it to be a bully and to see tits.
For Do We Care, I gave it an 8.
I gave it a 7. I did care. She's a sweet girl who just feels very strongly about this. And I believe that she believes what she believed, you know? I felt terrible for her.
My average came to 6.7.
6.6.
Wow. So that comes to 6.65. Saint Joan, you earned a spot in the Catholic pantheon of saints, but you did not earn a second opinion.
And that's okay. I can't even imagine how awful these second opinions would be.
Is there anything else that you would recommend that people watch or listen to?
I'm going to just, again, go hard and recommend You Must Remember This' series, Jean and Jane, to learn more about Jean Seberg's life and what she experienced. And how in many ways her own experience mirrors Joan of Arc's experience in terms of what she dealt with. And also, we mentioned Breathless. It's fabulous. It is the only tolerable Godard. I haven't seen the movie, Seberg. How do you feel about that movie?
I think we'll probably wind up giving it a 6 point something when we get to watching it.
What about you? Anything you would recommend?
For some fun light reading about how messy these people were, the Philippa Gregory novels about the Wars of the Roses that were subsequently made into Stars series. I love that stuff. You get to see the long, sad story of what happens to Warwick's family after he kicks it. I guess my guilty pleasures are, I don't watch reality TV. I read these hopelessly middlebrow things that are derived from history and usually about women through a woman's lens. If you want to see a 360-degree view of what Preminger, the person, was like offset, read Tom Wolfe's Radical Chic, where there is a scene where he creates a very awkward moment at a party that the Bernsteins were throwing for the Black Panther Party. The book is a very good send-up of the kind of performative allyship that our parents' generation called limousine liberalism, and some in our world would call elite wokeness. There's this whole part where it talks about how Felicia Bernstein had to find white help around the house because if they were, for example, having over the Black Panthers or someone from Alvin Ailey, they couldn't have black help, which meant that they couldn't hire black help.
I don't want to watch the Bradley Cooper movie because I find him being thirsty for awards is the least interesting Bradley Cooper. I have not hit the play button on that film yet, but I wonder if that makes its way into that movie. Probably not.
Maestro could be Oscar Bation. Somehow I don't think Maestro is closely related to the Radical Chic. Is there any other Shaw that we'd like to recommend?
Definitely read the play. The play's a great read.
The play is a great read, and it has some things I still remember finding delightful that were cut.
If I'm reading the play correctly, which whether or not it's real is beside the point. Like her experience, like whether or not it's real is beside the point. It is about the politics. It is about shutting a woman down. Like it's super transgressive for its time. He wrote some really interesting parts for women.
Plays were written to be performed, but Saint Joan the play is a memorable read, just exploring the language, and it's highly quotable.
When you start to like stack up the things he wrote against each other, it's like, wow, he understood what it meant to be a woman in a way, as much as any man could. He writes very well about the female experience when you start looking at all of the things together.
Makes me wonder if he was a good listener.
You must have to be to write the way he does. He must have been a good listener. Like, someone dig up his corpse and ask.
It's been lovely speaking with you about Saint Joan tonight.
If you like this show, please leave us a 5-star rating and subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And tell a friend, or better yet, plural friends, and share us on social media. We hear it helps. You can follow us on Instagram, where we have visual aids from our episodes. Our Instagram handle is at Biopic a Podcast Story. So do check us out there, and we'll link to that in our show notes as well. Please also check out our webpage at biopicapodcaststory.podbean.com to see our official episode ratings for all of the movies that we've done so far. If you would like to get in touch, you can email us at biopiclistenermailbag@gmail.com. And this will all be in the show notes, so you don't need to be like stopping your car to write all this down.
Tune in next week when we'll be talking about Ray.
Well, you have a lovely evening, and we'll talk to you soon.
Yes.